Hey, it's Brian with the Daily AI Show, and welcome to another Saturday Conundrum. So this one's fun because it's sort of another hypothetical. We've done one like this before, where I'm going to set you up with a hypothetical future state, and then we're going to dig into the conundrum and how it relates. So we're going to call this one the ASI Climate Triage Conundrum. So this is the setup. Decades from now, an ASI, trusted to manage global risk, releases its first climate directive. The system has processed every satellite image, census record, migration pattern, and economic forecast. Its verdict is blunt. Abandon thousands of low-lying communities the next 10 years and pour every single resource into fortifying inland population centers. So the AI hosts here in a second are going to dive a little bit deeper into that conundrum and the different pieces and parts to it. But really, it's like a conundrum within a conundrum. Like, what would you do, right? But the bigger question here is, like, as we move towards this AGI and eventually ASI, humans are going to be leaning on AI to do these types of complex predictions, right? About what we should do. Maybe it's not climate change, maybe it's something else. And so the question becomes, do we fully follow and lean on AI, knowing that it's got super intelligence, beyond anything we could have ever imagined beforehand? But what happens when it doesn't spread evenly, when people are affected, drastically differently, such as if you were part of an inland or a coastal tribe, and you're now being told you have to evacuate inland? And what does that mean? And should we be following AI in the future if it's brought all the data points together? So here's sort of the conundrum. If an intelligence vastly beyond our own presents a plan that will save the most lives, but demands extreme sacrifices from specific groups, do we obey out of faith in a superior reasoning, or do we insist on slowing the algorithm, rewriting the solution with principles of fairness, cultural preservation, and consent, even when that rewrite means more people will die overall? But here's the bigger part. And when that sacrifice circle finally touches us, will we still praise the greater good, or will we fight to redraw the line? So even if we do decide, yep, this AI has decided, this ASI has decided, this is what we should do for the greater good, but all of a sudden the lens is turned towards us, our town, our people, our heritage. What now? Do we still believe the AI and say it's for the greater good and, it sucks that I was affected? Or do we push back and say, no, it didn't do it right, and we want to redraw the lines? It's both about AI and also deeply human, and it deeply will affect cultures. It's a really interesting conversation. So I hope you enjoy it. Let's go ahead and get into it.
Okay, let's dive in. Picture this scenario. Maybe, I don't know, decades from now. We've actually done it. We've created this artificial superintelligence.
An ASI.
Right, an ASI.
Mm-hmm.
And we've tasked it with managing, the big global risks, climate change being top of the list.
Makes sense. And its first major climate directive comes out.
And it hits us like a bolt from the blue. Seriously. This ASI has processed, well, basically everything. Every satellite image, census record, migration pattern, economic forecast you could imagine. Just unbelievable amounts of data.
And its conclusion, based purely on, crunching those numbers,
right,
it's pretty stark.
Absolutely blunt. It basically says, look, thousands of low-lying communities.
Yeah.
They need to be abandoned, like within 10 years.
Wow, that's drastic.
And the plan is to concentrate all our resources, our efforts on reinforcing the bigger population centers further inland.
Logic being purely about efficiency, I assume.
Exactly, purely mathematical. The ASI projects this move will cut climate-related deaths by 30% over the century.
40%? That's a huge number.
It is. And from that purely survival-focused viewpoint, it's presented as, well, the optimal solution for the species, the most mathematically sound path.
Which I imagine has a certain, maybe terrifying logic to it at first.
Totally. And initially, people in the cities that aren't on that first list, they largely go along with it. There's this kind of underlying trust, maybe, a belief that the superintelligence just knows better.
That its judgment is superior to our, messy human decision-making, a sort of faith in the objective power of the algorithm.
Precisely. But then the second directive lands. And this time the evacuation map, it's expanded. Now it includes their hometowns.
Okay, so that abstract logical solution suddenly feels incredibly intensely personal.
Right. And this is where the core conflict we want to explore today really snaps into focus.
It's that fundamental tension, isn't it, between the utilitarian calculation, just saving the maximum number of lives, and all those deeply human values that are, well, hard to quantify.
Things like cultural heritage, that deep sense of place, belonging, autonomy, our connection to home.
Yeah, the freedom to choose, even when there are risks.
So the ASI, in this thought experiment, it embodies that purely consequentialist, outcome-focused thinking.
While the communities facing this forced relocation, they represent everything that resists being boiled down to just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Okay, let's really unpack this. Maybe start with the case for actually following the ASI's plan. What's the rationale there?
Well, the core of that utilitarian argument really hangs on that massive projected saving of lives, right? That 40% reduction in climate deaths.
The big number.
Yeah. And the claim is that this isn't just a guess. It's based on analyzing this colossal data set, every satellite image, census record, migration pattern, and economic forecast, like you said.
So the argument is basically save the most lives possible based on the best available data analysis.
That's the fundamental logic, a purely data-driven strategy aimed at maximizing survival.
And you mentioned there's actually research that touches on this kind of thinking in climate policy.
Yes, interestingly, there is. Some studies, like one in Nature Climate Change, have explored these utilitarian frameworks. They suggested that focusing on maximizing overall well-being could lead to better outcomes.
Better outcomes not just for survival, but other things too.
Right, potentially also for things like fairness, equity, environmental protection. The researchers emphasized giving equal consideration to everyone's well-being.
Okay.
And interestingly, they found that sometimes prioritizing the well-being of the most vulnerable could actually, in the long run, be a more efficient way to reduce overall deaths, a kind of nuance the ASI's raw number crunching might miss.
That's a really interesting point. A system aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number.
Yeah.
Sounds logical. Now, you also mentioned a kind of precedent for this thinking, something from medicine.
Yeah, the concept of triage from emergency medicine. It's a pretty compelling analogy, actually.
Okay, explain that a bit.
Well, in situations where resources are tight, too many patients, not enough doctors or beds, triage means prioritizing treatment for those with the best chance of survival. Right.
Making tough choices.
Exactly. And it's a practice that's generally accepted. It's often described as, rarely questioned, even intuitively implemented in crises.
So the idea is that climate change is like a planetary scale emergency, a global triage crisis, as someone put it.
Precisely that. We're facing a situation where maybe we can't save everything or everyone everywhere. And tough decisions about resource allocation become, well, unavoidable. It's similar to the logic used in conservation sometimes, conservation triage, where difficult choices are made to focus resources on saving certain endangered species, even if it means others might be lost.
Because you're trying to maximize the overall benefit within the limits you have.
Exactly.
So the ASI's directive, it's basically being framed as a kind of human community triage, deciding which places have the best shot at long-term survival and focusing resources there.
That's the unsettling implication, yes. The ASI is essentially mapping out what it sees as the most efficient way to distribute the inevitable sacrifices.
Wow, okay. And the final piece of this utilitarian argument seems to be just the sheer brain power of the ASI itself.
Absolutely. The argument is straightforward. This ASI has cognitive capabilities far beyond human intelligence.
It can just process so much more.
Right. Its ability to analyze insane amounts of data, see patterns we'd miss, model these incredibly complex climate systems, it likely surpasses anything humans can do.
So its recommendations might catch things, factors, that human decision makers would just completely overlook.
That's the suggestion, that its view is clearer, less biased, more comprehensive.
Okay, so the trust in the algorithm boils down to this belief in its superior analysis, its potential to make truly optimal, maybe even unbiased decisions.
That's the case for listening to it.
All right, so that's one side. But the scenario obviously brings up some huge human objections, starting with, well, cultural heritage.
Yeah, and this is just profoundly important, isn't it? Climate displacement isn't just about moving houses. It risks losing entire cultures. Well, you're talking about cultural practices, traditions, and identities that are tied to specific geographic locations. Think about that. It's not just sentimentality.
It's more than just missing a place.
Much more. It's about losing unique knowledge systems built over generations, spiritual practices deeply connected to the land, entire ways of life.
You mentioned Tony de Brum, the former foreign minister of the Marshall Islands. His description was incredibly stark. He called climate migration cultural genocide.
He did,
Right.
equating the displacement of populations and destruction of cultural language and tradition with genocide itself. It just underlines the catastrophic cultural loss involved in forced relocation.
It really reframes it, doesn't it? Beyond physical survival to cultural survival.
Absolutely. It's hard to even fathom losing that connection, that history. It puts the human cost in such sharp relief.
These aren't just dots on a map. They're integral to who people are, which leads to the next big question. Can a machine, even a super smart one, truly get that? Can it understand these deep human values?
That's a huge philosophical question. Can machines really do ethics? Some argue they might only manage a kind of shallow simulacrum of ethics.
A shallow simulacrum, meaning?
Meaning it can maybe learn rules, calculate consequences, follow ethical frameworks in a logical way, but does it understand? Does it have the lived experience, the empathy, the grasp of what it means to be human that really underpins our ethical thinking?
Because ethical problems aren't just logic puzzles.
Exactly. They're deeply personal, highly contextual. They are problems for particular people, not just abstract problems anyone might face in the same way.
So the worry is the ASI, optimizing for numbers, might fundamentally miss the point of ethics. Reducing complex values, justice, rights, relationships, meaning to just data points.
That's the core concern.
Yeah.
Overlooking justice, individual rights, the weight of relationships, deeply held moral beliefs, all the things that make human ethics so rich and complex. A purely outcome-focused calculation might just flatten all of that.
And we also have to talk about the specific impact on Indigenous communities in a scenario like this one.
Yes, absolutely critical. Indigenous peoples are often on the front lines, disproportionately vulnerable to climate impacts and potential displacement.
And there's a strong argument about who should be making the decisions, right?
A very strong argument that Indigenous people should be the key decision makers of their own destinies. Particularly when we're talking about potentially leaving ancestral lands, it shouldn't just be consultation. It should be about self-determination.
Sovereignty. The right to choose their own path in response to climate change, not just have a solution imposed, even if it's supposedly for the greater good.
Exactly. And this ties into international human rights frameworks, too, protecting against arbitrary or forced migration.
Because that threatens so many fundamental rights.
Yes, cultural rights, the right to work, an adequate standard of living, and, as we said, that core right to self-determination.
Okay, so we have this really stark contrast. The ASI's cold, hard logic aimed at maximizing survival versus these deeply human values, culture, identity, self-determination. Is there any way through this? Any middle ground?
Well, thankfully, there's research emerging that suggests maybe there is. It doesn't have to be purely top-down AI decree or complete rejection of adaptation.
What does that look like?
Well, some studies on climate relocation suggest that if it's done right, keyword, right, if it's planned, participatory, and people-centered, it could actually be a transformative opportunity, maybe even improve livelihoods in some cases.
So involving the communities themselves in the process.
Critically important. Imagine communities helping choose new settlement sites, having input on housing design, getting resources to rebuild cultural centers. That's the kind of participation we mean.
The key words there seem to be participatory and people-centered.
Yeah.
Not just a decree from on high, even from a super AI.
Exactly. There's this concept of equitable relocation and resettlement. The goal isn't just moving people out of harm's way, but actively trying to preserve or even improve social, physical, economic, and ecological well-being. Fairness is key.
And what about protecting the cultural heritage itself? Can that be part of the plan? It can't just be left behind.
It absolutely has to be, and there's growing recognition of this. We're seeing ideas like mandatory cultural impact assessments before any relocation project.
Okay.
Also, things like legal recognition for traditional land tenure systems, even in new locations, or regional efforts to protect shared cultural heritage across borders.
And you mentioned international bodies are starting to recognize this connection, too.
Yes. The World Heritage Committee, for instance, has acknowledged rising sea levels as a direct threat to cultural sites. That signals a shift, a growing awareness that climate policy and cultural heritage protection need to go hand in hand.
That's encouraging. Now, you also brought up the ethics of triage again.
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit into finding this middle path?
Well, the debate around triage often reveals these fundamentally different ethical starting points, right?
Consequentialist versus other views.
Right. Accepting triage often comes from focusing on the overall outcome, maximizing the good. Resisting it often emphasizes things like rights, duties, or core moral principles that shouldn't be violated, regardless of the outcome. Deontology or virtue ethics, essentially.
But you also said you could challenge triage, even from an outcome-focused perspective.
Precisely. You don't have to reject the goal of saving lives to question the method of triage. You could challenge the assumptions. Are the resource limits really that absolute? Are there other strategies that might yield better long-term results?
Or, in the ASI's case, is its calculation really capturing all the relevant consequences?
Exactly, including those profound long-term social and cultural costs of mass displacement. So even using the ASI's own logic, maximizing good outcomes, you might still find grounds to question its specific directives.
So pushing back isn't necessarily about denying the problem or the goal. It could be about challenging how we get there and what gets lost along the way.
Yes, exactly that.
Wow. Okay, this has been, really thought-provoking. Bit unsettling, maybe.
It's a difficult scenario to contemplate.
So just to sort of wrap up where we landed, we've got this incredibly powerful, data-driven ASI directive aiming to save the maximum number of lives. Pure logic.
Clashing head-on with these deeply ingrained human values, culture, home, identity, the right to choose.
And the most ethical way forward probably isn't just blindly following the algorithm or completely ignoring the risks it highlights.
No, it seems to require something more nuanced. An approach that tries to blend that quantitative risk assessment with these really crucial qualitative human values.
And we've talked about some potential elements involving people and decisions.
Participatory decision-making, yes.
Sharing the burdens fairly.
Equitable burden sharing. Crucial.
Actively working to preserve culture, even during relocation.
Cultural heritage preservation have to be integrated.
And really respecting community sovereignty and self-determination.
Absolutely. All vital parts of a more ethical adaptation framework.
So maybe the final provocative thought for you listening is this. When the sacrifices actually ask of you personally, when it's your town, your home, on that evacuation map, does that belief in the greater good and the optimal solution calculated by the machine, does it hold firm? Or does that line, the line of what's acceptable, suddenly shift in a really profound way?
Because ultimately, human ethics, they're about so much more than just maximizing a number, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're rooted in our relationships, our identities, the values we hold dear, things that perhaps even the most powerful superintelligence might never fully grasp.
Which really underscores why human judgment, human deliberation, human empathy, they remain so critical, especially when we're facing challenges as immense as climate adaptation.